Hi, welcome to another Woodworking for Beginners, and today we're going to be looking at the Mortise Tenon joint. I'm going to be making a stub Mortise Tenon, which is about the simplest one you can do, and I hope you'll follow along and try one yourself. So what tools am I going to use? Let's look down here on the bench. I'm going to make it fairly simple, using the minimum tools really necessary. So to actually make the mortise, we're going to need a chisel. I've picked up a really cheap one here just to show that it's possible, and also we're doing something else with this. But this is going to be straight out the packet as it comes from the shop. That's a 6mm chisel. I've got a little utility knife rather than a marking knife, so I know a lot of you won't have a marking knife to begin with. I've got one of my other chisels. This is quite a nice chisel. It's just a little bit wider. You could equally have a fairly cheap chisel, a little bit wider. Makes for easier pairing of the tenon when we make that. And then for the actual marking out, I'm going to be doing it all with a combination square. These are very easy to get hold of, just one piece of kit to buy, and I'll show you a method to use that. Now, because I'm going to be using this cheap chisel and it's got a plastic handle and no strike through cap on the end, I don't want to be hitting it with a hammer as I would normally do with my other chisels. I'm going to be using a wooden mallet. And for sawing the tenons, I've just got this cheap hardened tip universal saw, so equally good for rip and cross cut, and you can pick these up for about a £5. Ordinarily though, you'd be better off with a tenon saw, and this again is a cheap variety with induction hardened teeth. So let's get started. So I'm going to be connecting these two pieces together almost as though this was a stile and this was a rail. I always like to start with the mortise for a very good reason. If you cut your tenon and then try and create a mortise that fits the tenon, invariably you'll make one that's too sloppy. Whereas if you make the mortise first, making a tenon a little bit too big, it makes it very easy then just to pare it down so it fits nicely. You also get problems with the angle at which it goes in. If you're not totally plumb into the work, then you can end up with things like this at an angle, and also with gaps at the front or the back if we've got the angle wrong going in this direction. So if we prepare the mortise and it's not quite perpendicular to this surface, we can then adjust it, and that would mean making it larger. So we can square it up, but it will make it wider. If you've already done your tenon and your tenon fits, if you then make the mortise wider, obviously the tenon's no good, it's too thin. So I like to start with the mortise. I'm not going to worry too much about where this goes in here. Let's just say we'll put it roughly there. I'll just give myself a rough mark. If you were following design, you wouldn't need to do this, but it just gives me an idea of where I'm supposed to have it. Now I'm going to do a tenon, which is probably leaving about 4 or 5mm all the way round for a shoulder. So staying back from this end and that end, and then the shoulder as well down the sides, like so. Now I've already picked my chisel. It's a 6mm one, so let's get it out of the packet. Hopefully it's going to be sharp enough to cut. I'm going to try and centre it on here. I'm going to be using the combination square. If I measure the width of this piece now, got fractionally under 40, so roughly tad under 20 will be the centre. So my mortise wants to run, if it's 6mm wide, from about 17 to about 23. The best way to do it is to set your combination square for the 17. So that's set to 17. That will give us one side of the mortise. So if I mark that in now, at the moment I'm just doing it in pencil so you can see what's going on. fact, it's not very clear, but it's a bit darker. So I've got my 17 mark. Now what I can do is I can put my chisel next to that, mark the other side of the chisel, so that'll be the other side of the mortise, and I can reset the combination square to exactly line up with how wide that was. And then I can easily mark the other side. Now we should find that the chisel fits nice and tight between those two lines. So we'll do that now, but we'll do it with a knife. We'll use the utility knife to knife in those lines. So I'll set this back to 17. And pop the chisel on there, up against that knife line, make a knife mark on the other side, and then I can use that mark, pop the knife in it, set the combination square to butt up to the knife, and then I can put the second knife line down for the other side of the mortise. Now if I reset the combination square to give me something long enough to go right across the work, I can then knife the two ends of what the mortise is going to be. And again, it's just where I've guessed, roughly there and there. Now when I chop the mortise, I want to leave, for the time being, about just shy of 1/4 inch at each end, because we lean the chisel and we pivot it on these ends as we're chopping out and going down deeper and deeper, and so these ends get ruined a little bit. So if we actually cut right to the end of the mortise and we were leaning on there, we'd crush the fibres here, possibly break out some material, and it might even get far enough to show on the workpiece. So it might not get covered up by the shoulders on the rail. So we'll leave those for the time being. We'll tackle those right at the end. I'm going to chop the mortise with the chisel, and I'm going to start in the middle. So I'll chop down a little way, move the chisel back, chop down again. Then I'm going to rock the chisel like so and eject a chip of material. Move along a bit more, chop down, rock, and then eject the material, and you'll see it as I do it. Now some people will put this in the vise and do it. I was always told when I was at school, never use the vise, because either you don't clamp it hard enough and it moves around under the pressure of striking the chisel, or if you clamp it hard enough then you're going to do damage to the vise mechanism because you're tightening it more than it's designed to take. And thirdly, if it's not quite tight enough in there, it's going to go down, it's going to bash the other side on the vise screw. So you've got to then find something to go underneath it and protect it. It seems far too complicated. For me, another reason I do it the way I do is because I want to use the bench. Now my component's nice and square all round, so I know that this face is parallel with the face underneath. I know I've got a flat bench, so if I pop that on the bench and I want to chop that one nice and plumb, I can use the combination square, set to 90 degrees, sat up on the bench. That will give me plumb in this direction and also in that direction. So I can line the main part of the chisel up with the edge of the square to make sure that I'm not leaning one way or the other. Now if it's in the vise, I can't be absolutely certain that it's going to be square this way, and possibly maybe not even quite square that way. So I do it on the bench top, and that means I've got to clamp it, otherwise it's going to fly around. And to avoid too much vibration when I'm chopping it, I'm going to do it over the leg of the bench. So the bench leg is here, pop that over there, clamp it towards this end. Now on a longer component it'd be great, you get a couple of clamps on, be nice and sound. On something short like this little scrap I'm using, there's a tendency just with one clamp for it to rotate, but it seems reasonably firm. So now I can use the combination square blade as a reference for my chisel. If I place it between those two knife lines, roughly in the middle, sit it upright, gauge it against that combination square. I can move that around to find which is the best position for me. I make sure it's nice and square, nice and upright. Hammer it down a little bit, and first time round, a little bit of leverage backwards and forwards, and it's only in the plane of the mortise, so backwards and forwards that way, never side to side. So then I'll move back a little bit, about 1/4 of an inch, set the chisel up nice and straight again. Push it forwards and then pull it backwards, and you should find that little chip gets ejected, and we've started our mortise. Now you can play around, there's still some waste in there. I can frig about and get that piece out as well, or you can just keep chopping, and you chop back until you get almost to this safety line that we put in. So let's work up to this end. And you'll see I'm actually hitting it harder every time I go. So there's 3 strikes for the first hole, 4 for the second. I've just done 5 there. They're relatively light. I could hit it harder rather than more times if I wanted to. And you can see just how much waste is coming out on that second time. Move it back again. So I hit it a bit harder that time, just 5 strikes, took me nice and deep, deeper than I went before. Lever a bit. Now these chisels are not like mortise chisels, they're not as strong, so I don't want to lever too much. So I've actually pulled the chisel up a bit as I've been levering. So I've still got some more chip down there at the bottom. I'll go back down and lever a little bit more out. And I've got to my safety line, and you can see there that it has crushed a little bit, and it's actually crushed and hinged off where I put the knife line through. So it's still lovely and clean at the knife line, which is where the shoulder is going to be sitting. But that other part is ruined. So if I chopped all the way back to that knife line, you can see that it would have ruined that area, part of which is underneath, will be under the shoulder of the tenon, but possibly it would have gone too far and we'd have seen it when everything was put together. So I don't want to go any further that way yet. Turn the chisel round so the bevel's facing that way, and I'll make my way back towards the other end. This time I'm leaning in the opposite direction. Lever back. This is where the clamp gets in the way. If you had 2 clamps, you had a longer component, you can put the clamps further apart. I think that's why many people are tempted to do it in the vise. You don't have to worry about the clamps being in the way. Lever forward, lever back. And you can always come around the other way to lever out the waste. In fact, what's quite nice to have is a slightly smaller chisel, because you've loosened the waste when you've chopped with this chisel. It's quite easy to get the waste out with a slightly thinner one. So I'm pretty much back at that end now. What I'm going to do is chop in the same direction, but I've now got the bevel upright. I'm going down on my safety line. Lever forward, lever back. You can hear it as the little bit of waste breaks off down in the mortise, and we can lever that out. I'll do the same thing here. So bevel is now perpendicular. Saves creating any more damage at that safety line. And it's just a question of going as deep as you want to go. At the moment I'm almost 3/4 of an inch, I'd say, so I want to go a bit deeper. I'll go back to the middle, do another pass, so strike in the middle, little bit of a wobble, lift it up, move it back. If you're using a mortise chisel, you could actually hit it harder to go deeper, and you could lever harder to get bigger chips out, and that's why I prefer them. But clearly it's quite possible to use bevel edge chisels and firmer chisels, which are slightly lighter than mortise chisels. I'm probably deep enough now, so I just need to clean the bottom up, move back in the opposite direction. This chisel seems a little bit sticky, and I think it's probably been sprayed with a protective for transport. So I'm doing what I always tell people not to do, and that's using a chisel straight out of the packet. You should always do a bit of preparation on a chisel, but I wanted to see that if you don't have the skills yet to do that tuning, you can actually get some woodwork done. Right, so I'm down to depth across this safety zone. Now what I want to do is just increase that towards the two ends. And to do that without causing too much damage, what I just want to do is take fine slices like so, and you find, like it's done there, it's broken off, little chip broken off at the knife line. That's absolutely fine. That knife line should hold everything, should stop any little splits like that going any further. Then finally I can put the chisel in the knife line. It's not too critical, because if you remember, we just guessed where we wanted to put that, because we're going to make our tenon to fit. We could have chosen anywhere we liked. At the moment I can lever off the other end, but in a second when I come back this way I'll have to just lever off my fingers like I'm showing you now, just to get the waste out. And that's all there's left to do to the mortise now, is just to clean it out and make the bottom nice and flat. So let's work back to this end. You'd have heard the tone change on the chisel there, and it gets to depth and the wedge starts to have a wedging action, or significant wedging action. It changes the tone. Now into the knife line, keep it upright, straight down to depth, wiggle it over, and now we don't want to lean on this end or that end if we can avoid it. So it's just a case of fishing out the waste the best way we can. What I'm trying to do at the bottom now is use the bevel just to guide the edge along the bottom, just to clean out, make it nice and flat. Obviously you've got a series of chop marks in there. Just trying to make it look a little bit nicer. The other thing you can do is pop the chisel down to the bottom and then use scraping motion along like so. Every so often get rid of the waste. So we've got a reasonably clean mortise there with a nice sharp chisel that's been prepared well. And when I say that, I mean these edges would be nice and sharp, all the sides would be nice and polished so there's no friction, and it obviously be a nice sharp blade. You can get remarkably clean mortises, but that's not bad. That would glue up well. So now it's time to make the tenon that's going to fit that mortise. We'll take all the measurements off the actual mortise. We need to take the depth from the mortise again. So you can use either the mortise chisel, just as a gauge like so, or if you've got a combination square, just pop that in there, let it fall down, move it across, find the highest point that's in the mortise, lock it off, measure it. It's just fractionally over an inch. So we know how long the tenon needs to be, we know how wide it needs to be, and we now know how deep it needs to be. So the next thing would be to mark off how far we're going to cut back. Two ways of doing this. You can either mark directly from the end, and this will be the end of the tenon, or we can put a shoulder line in anywhere, cut a tenon that's too long, and then trim it down to the right size. And there are reasons for doing both ways. Usually if I'm working with power tools, I'll cut the component to the exact length including tenons, and then I can very quickly grab a marking gauge, mark all the way round, and that gives me the shoulder line to cut to. But if I'm doing things with hand tools, I just overcut the components in their length, and then I'll mark out the exact length between, if it's legs or stiles, I'll mark that in with a couple of knife points. Then I'll use a square or combination square, whichever, to put those knife lines right the way round, which gives me the shoulder lines for both of those tenons. I'll prepare the tenons. They'll be a little too long, and then I can take the depth, mark the depth from the shoulder line up the tenon, and then cut the tenon off at the right length. And anyway, that's the method I'm going to do today. I'm just going to mark round a shoulder line. Bear in mind, which end was it? I think it was that end I was joining on. So we need something that's at least an inch long. We don't want one that's going to end up short. So we'll go about 1.25 inches, and then we'll trim our tenon afterwards. I'd prefer using a little engineer's square rather than the combination square. But you could use the combination. So, pretty random where I'm putting that. But I'll square it round, and I'm putting quite a deep knife line in. And this is going to try and keep it nice and clean. So I'm holding the blade of the square on the material that's going to be kept on the show face. So that stops anything tearing out with the knife. This is going to be the waist side where we're going to prepare the tenon. So mark it relatively deep, carry that line all the way around. Now I'm using a knife with a double bevel on it, which is not ideal, but I think it's probably what most people have when they start out. Just be a little careful when you're using it to tilt the knife a little bit so it's the actual bevel that rides against the knife rather than the side of the blade. That just ensures that you get your knife line right up against the edge of the steel of the blade. So many blades. There's a blade of the square, the blade of the knife. But we want that line to match up exactly with where we put the square. If our component was prepared nice and square all round, then this final knife line should meet up with these two coming up the faces. Thank heavens for that. So they might meet up all the way around. That knife line is nice and clean. We've protected the parts we want to keep from any tear out. The only thing now is to make sure that when we saw the shoulders, we don't saw into this knife line. We've got to protect that knife line as much as we can. So the next thing is to saw them, and you could just take a saw straight to that and you'd probably be okay, as long as you keep the saw on the waste side. But a handy tip, and I think it's worthwhile doing, it doesn't take very long, is to put create a little knife wall. So using a chisel, you could use the same one, but it just take a long time because it's so narrow. So I've got a slightly wider one here. We'll just, from the waist side, pare in towards the base of the knife line that we just created. And you'll hear a clunk when it goes into there. That little piece will flop out. Be gentle. I've seen people do this with, an awful lot of effort and then flicking bits and even not getting all the way through and then trying to rub it off. And everything you do like that, there's a chance of marking this knife line and tearing out some material. So just be careful with it. You should be paring deep enough with a chisel, and your knife line should be deep enough that they meet each other and those pieces just fall out very easily indeed. And if you pare and they don't fall out, it's probably because your knife line isn't quite deep enough. So there, maybe I'm not quite deep enough in that position there. But I don't want to be particularly physical with it. I want it to fall out. I don't want to damage that lovely shoulder line that I've got. Okay. So with that done, we can put that chisel away for the moment. And then we've got a saw. I've got another line there. Look at that. Get carried away. So the final shoulder line. Now, I'm going to prepare it with this, which is a bit of a beast. Look at the teeth on that. You wouldn't normally do neat joinery with that. So this is really to show you that the knife line, the knife wall, nice and deep, and the method I'm going to be cutting it, it's going to protect those things and we don't need to worry too much. What I need to think about though when I'm sawing is how deep I go. So marking in the width is a good idea to start with. So put it in place, see what there is, measure it. So I'm looking there at, I'll do it from my end because I want it in centimetres, since the chisel was in centimetres as well. I'm looking at 8mm on both sides. So 8mm shoulder on both sides of that, that mortise. Set that to 8mm, then I can, off the side, mark a line down here and there. Now, a pencil has a certain width to it, so we'll end up with something probably a bit shy of the mortise. We'll just make sure we leave the pencil line when we saw. So that's the waste, that's the waste. So to saw these, I would normally use a tenon saw or dovetail saw, something smaller, depending on the size. It would normally be a backed saw like this one here, which removes, this doesn't remove all the flex, but the old nice brass back one would reduce all the flex. But for this exercise I'm going to use a rough saw just to show that you can produce nice tight lines even if you're using a rough saw. So I'm going to lean this in, put it on the ramp that we've created when we paired that down to the knife wall. Let it come down so the edge of the teeth just hit that knife wall. And you see that the saw is slightly tilted, so the teeth are on each side of the set are sitting flat on the slope until we just get it started. Get started, we can bring the saw up square. And we just want to go down to a little bit shy of those lines. A little bit more. Okay, so we've sawn down to depth on both sides, and then we'll just saw these cheeks off, so sawing down these lines to meet up with those shoulder lines. So I'll clamp my tenon in the vise now. I can see my lines on the top and I can see them along the sides. So I'll just try and decide now, am I going to saw those off or am I going to chop them off? Two methods. Really look at the grain and decide which is the best way to do it. Looking down here, it looks fairly straight grain. And it does the other side. In fact, they all do. So possibly a better way to do it would be to split that out. Now, you've got to be reasonably sure it's going to go the right way. If you get a split develop here, and it comes in at an angle like this across your tenon, well, you've ruined your tenon. If it splits out that way, not a problem at all. But ideally it will split almost straight down, and you've got to remove most of that material just with a few chops into the end grain. Alternative to that is to saw it, and in which case you stay on the waste side of the line, start the saw in the corner, tracking this line along the top, and then once you've got in all the way along there, gradually track the line down the front edge, then reverse it and track the line down the back edge. So I'll probably do one of them like that, but I'll show you the splitting out method as well. So what I like to do is stay a long way away from where the tenon is and take a couple of test tries and see which way it splits. So only light taps needed here, and that's why the vise is fine. And you can see it's breaking out. It's almost straight, but if anything, slightly out away from the side of the wood. So that's good. Let's just test it all the way along in case anything changes. Yeah, that's looking good. That's looking good. And of course, what you realise is it's going to break off when it gets down to that saw cut. So now I can go back towards my tenon line. I don't want to go all the way there yet. We might find that the grain starts splitting slightly different as we get further or closer and closer to the tenon line. And that's almost there. And the grain's moving around a little bit. It's not really nice and straight, but it's reasonably good. But then I can take the chisel and quickly clean up. Just being careful not to touch these edges down here. So I'm running the back of the chisel flat on the wood here, bringing it down at this edge, close to the line but not right onto it. We want to fit the tenon when we've cut both sides. So it's not, I'm happy with that side now. We'll come around to this side, get a little bit closer. Pair across so we meet up with the other half of it. So that's pretty good. A few little hairs at the bottom. If we just run the chisel like that, we can clean those up. So that's how I would chop the tenon. To saw it, as I said, again, stay away from the line a little bit. So I've established the saw in the cut, in the right place across the top. Now I'll drop the saw down on my side, down to the bottom or down to the shoulder line. Not cutting all the way to the shoulder line because we don't want to risk actually breaking that shoulder line. So that's how far I've come down. Flip it around, do the other side. Ignore the cove that's in this piece of wood. It's just a little bit of waste I found that would be good for the example. And then you've got a little triangle left in the middle, obviously. So straighten things up and saw down to that. And this is where sometimes you'll get some problems. If you saw down right the way down, suddenly you're going to break through and you're going to saw into these two faces and you're going to ruin those nice lines. So take it gently. You'll see it starts to hinge by itself. They're almost there. And at the end there, I would snap that off. I think that's the safest way to go. Still left with the same problem we had when we chopped it. It's not quite smooth, not quite even. So we go in with the chisel. You can still see my lines quite clearly on the top here. So I can be quite confident, but I will keep checking with my mortise just to make sure. Now if you're working just with chisels, then it's simply a matter of using the chisel to pare away, bring both sides down towards the line. Keeping them nice and flat by using the flat of the chisel to register all the way along the cut. Working from both sides. I guess my favourite method is the router plane. So this is the router plane. Got an iron on it that I can raise and lower below this flat bed. If I put the flat bed on the surface of the face of the tenon board, I can lower that iron. I've just got to raise it now. Lower it until it just skims the surface, not cutting anything, and lower it a little bit. And obviously I will need that in the vise. And you can see with that blade clamped slightly lower than the surface, if I press down hard on this side, it registers that blade nice and parallel. And we can work that side of the tenon. lower the blade slightly. And cut a bit more. So that's the router plane. That's what I prefer for doing tenons. But I also like the shoulder plane. Shoulder plane, the blade comes right out the side of the plane. So it's exposed by perhaps a 32nd of an inch either side, and you can shift it so it's absolutely flush if you want. So that means you can get right up close to your shoulder lines. You've got no reference here for what is actually parallel to this surface, so you have to be careful and just take the same amount off right the way across the tenon. Now, before I get carried away, I should recheck that in my mortise. And see, it's just squeezing in pretty tight, so I want it a little bit less than that. So I shall go back to the chisel, because I think that's what most of you will be using to begin with, and we'll just take a little bit more out. So I shall start at this edge, oh sorry, just slightly away from the edge, work across taking an equal amount, then turn around and come back the other way, which in reality means turning the piece around. So now, registering on the piece I've already cut, I can take what I left high on the other end, just cutting into the baseline there to remove those little fibres. Again, staying away from that knife line. I have been asked in the past, why don't you saw to the line, and then you wouldn't have to do any of this. And I guess the reason really is this is no effort at all to do this. And if I wasn't talking to you about it, it would go quicker. But what I can guarantee is if I don't saw right up to the line, I'm never going to get in a situation where my tenon is too loose. So it's always better, I feel, to creep up from a tight fit to the sort of snug fit that you want. Now I can mark for the length of my tenon. So line everything up where it wants to go. Across my mortise, so I can see my mortise hole. I can see that these are lined up with the original lines I put in. Just mark now for the length of the mortise. I always go very slightly less than the length. That gives me a little bit of wiggle room, and after all, it's the long grain surfaces that we're gluing, not to the end grain, so that's all you need to do. So mark those, copy that line down. Use your finger as a guide just to copy that down the tenon, both sides, and then we'll saw for those, and we'll saw first of all down towards that line on both sides, and then we'll rip down to take those pieces out. I'm staying away so I'm not right near my knife line. Like we did the cheeks, we could actually split these off. So cleaning up these shoulder lines, which is going to make our joint look really nice, is all to do with using that knife line that we originally made. And I think you can probably see, if you look carefully around the edge there, you can see a little bit different from the saw mark. There's a cut line cut mark rather than a saw mark. And what we need to do now is register the chisel on that knife mark and then pare across to the base of the tenon. And we want to be creating a very slight undercut, so slightly down as we do it. Now I'm using a chisel which is narrower than the piece of work, so I can do an undercut without damaging either of the knife lines. So on the knife line, ease it forwards, and that was a little bit thick to take. You can take it in a couple of passes if you need to. Like so. Flip it around to the other side, exactly the same. We'll take this in a couple of passes because it is quite thick. On the knife line, press down. Okay, just extend it a little bit towards the edges. And then I'm going to find this easier to do in the other vise. So on the knife line, press down, pare into the base of the tenon. Just work your way along. So we're never actually cutting on the edge of the work here. We're always starting from on top of the knife line. Oh, nearly forgot the length. That would have been tragic, wouldn't it? It wouldn't have gone all the way in. Square that across. Now I'm just going to chamfer. There's got a nasty edge there, having done that. So we'll just clean that up with a little chamfer across there. Chamfer this side. And the ends. And let's try again. So it's over the leg. It was that way round. I might need a mallet. It's tightening up a little bit. No. There we go. So we don't have any of that roughness around the edge. Got nice tight joint lines all the way around. So I'm happy with that.